The morning light seeped through the faded curtains of Margaret Cole's small suburban home, falling gently on the empty dining table. There were 6 chairs, but only one ever pulled out. Hers. Every Mother's Day morning for the past 12 years, she had done the same thing: wake up early, make herself tea, set the table for company that never came, and tell herself that this year, maybe, one of her 3 children would remember. But they didn't. Not since their father passed. Not since the quiet arguments that turned into distance. Not since life, in all its unfair noise, scattered them to different cities, different worlds. Margaret stirred her tea slowly, her hand trembling slightly from age, or maybe from the memory. She stared at the framed photo on the wall, a younger version of herself, holding her 3 smiling children, all wearing sun hats at a beach they used to visit every summer. The photo was bright, her present was not. This Mother's Day felt heavier, maybe because the house had grown quieter, the refrigerator buzzed louder, the clock ticked slower, maybe because she'd stopped pretending that anyone would knock. Her neighbor, Mrs. Anders, an old widow with more cats than patience, called from the porch, "Margaret, you coming to church today?" Margaret smiled politely. "Not today, love. I'll stay in." Mrs. Anders frowned but didn't push. Everyone in the neighborhood knew Margaret's story. The mother who raised 3 kids alone, gave them everything, and somehow ended up forgotten. 15 years ago, her house had been full of life. Her oldest, Daniel, used to play guitar in the living room, his deep laugh echoing down the hallway. Claire, her middle child, always had her nose in a book, arguing about everything but hugging her mother tightly every night. And Eddie, the youngest, had a habit of sneaking cookies before dinner, always smiling, always forgiven. Those were the days when her husband, Tom, would wrap an arm around her and whisper, "They'll always come back to their mother, Maggie. Always." But Tom died one quiet autumn morning, a heart attack while reading the newspaper. The world tilted. Bills piled up. The children grew apart, their grief turning into blame. The phone calls stopped one by one. Daniel, now a lawyer in New York, texted once a year, "Happy Mother's Day. Mom, hope you're well." Claire, teaching abroad, sent cards without return addresses. Eddie, the one who'd promised he'd never leave, hadn't called in 3 years. Sometimes, when Margaret sat by the window at night, she imagined hearing their laughter again. She even talked to their photos. "I must have done something wrong," she whispered once, tears streaming down her wrinkled cheeks. "I tried so hard. I really did." That afternoon, when she finally opened her front door to get the mail, a gust of wind blew a small newspaper across her feet. She bent down and noticed an ad circled in red marker, though she hadn't done it. It read, "For sale, cozy beach cottage. Ocean view, quiet neighborhood, perfect for peaceful living." Margaret stared at it. The beach. Something inside her stirred. Something she thought was long dead. She remembered the photo on her wall. The laughter, the sandcastles, the smell of sunscreen and salt. That was the last time her family had been whole. Maybe if she went back to the ocean, she could find herself again. Or maybe she just needed a new place to be lonely in. Either way, she tore the ad out and slipped it into her pocket. That night, she made herself a cup of chamomile tea and sat at the kitchen table with her old checkbook. Her hands shook slightly as she counted her savings, the leftover money from Tom's insurance, untouched for years. "I'll buy it," she whispered. It was impulsive, maybe foolish, but something about the idea of hearing waves again, of feeling the sea breeze on her skin, made her heart beat with a strange, youthful rhythm. For the first time in years, she wasn't thinking about who didn't call. She was thinking about where she could start over. The next morning, she called the number in the ad. Her voice trembled slightly when the man on the other end said, "Yes, ma'am." "The cottage is still available. Is it near the old pier?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am. Sunset Bay." Sunset Bay, the very beach where that photo had been taken. Her breath caught. "I'll take it," the man laughed softly. Don't you want to see it first? No need, she said. I already know what it looks like. For days, Margaret packed. Not furniture, but fragments of a life. A chipped teacup Tom loved. Claire's childhood drawings. A seashell Eddie once gave her. A framed letter Daniel had written when he was 10. Mom, you're the best thing in the world. By the time the moving truck arrived, her little house looked naked, but her heart felt unexpectedly light. She left a note on the fridge for the new owner. This home held love once. I hope it holds yours too. Then she closed the door for the last time. It took her 6 hours to reach Sunset Bay. She drove slowly, letting the memories roll by with the miles. The first glimpse of the ocean made her gasp. The water shimmered gold under the late afternoon sun, and seagulls circled lazily above the waves. Her new home was small. White walls, blue shutters, and a porch that looked out to infinity. When she stepped inside, it smelled of salt and pine. Empty, but peaceful. She opened the windows, let the breeze in, and whispered to herself, "Welcome home, Maggie." For the first time in years, she smiled without forcing it. She cooked herself a simple dinner, tomato soup and toast, and sat by the window, listening to the ocean whisper against the shore. No children, no phone calls. But somehow, it didn't hurt as much. When the clock struck midnight, the waves outside seemed to sing softly, as if saying, "You're not done yet." Margaret looked at the stars and smiled. Maybe not. She didn't know that the next Mother's Day, her quiet little beach house would be full again, full of voices, apologies, and tears she never expected to hear again. The morning sun spilled through the lace curtains of Margaret's new beach cottage, filling the room with soft gold. The rhythmic crash of waves felt like a heartbeat, slow, steady, comforting. It had been 3 days since she moved in, and for the first time in over a decade, she felt something she couldn't quite name. Not happiness, not yet, but peace. She made tea in her small, sea-facing kitchen and stepped out onto the porch. The salt air brushed her cheeks. In the distance, a fisherman's boat glided over the horizon. Seagulls danced above it, their cries carried by the wind. Margaret closed her eyes and smiled faintly. "This," she whispered, "is what freedom sounds like." Later that morning, as she took her first walk along the beach, she noticed an old man sitting alone near the water. His hat tilted forward, covering most of his face, but his posture was strong, like someone used to waiting. Margaret hesitated before walking closer. The man turned slightly and smiled. His eyes were kind, framed by deep lines of age and laughter. "Morning," he said. "Good morning," she replied. He looked at her shoes, city flats, now damp with sand. "You're not from around here," Margaret chuckled softly. "That obvious? Only tourists wear shoes to the water," he said with a grin. "Locals go barefoot." She looked down, then slipped off her shoes. The sand was warm, the sensation both strange and soothing. "I used to come here with my family," she said quietly, "a long time ago." The man nodded, glancing at the horizon. "Funny thing about this place, it remembers everyone who's ever loved it." Margaret smiled at that. "Does it remember names too?" He paused, his eyes softening. "Only the ones who whispered them into the wind." Each day settled into a gentle rhythm. Mornings by the sea, afternoons tending to the little garden behind the cottage, evenings reading on the porch until the sky turned violet. For once, silence didn't feel like punishment. It felt like rest. She started painting again, something she hadn't done since Tom passed. Her hands were stiff, her brush strokes shaky, but the colors flowed anyway. Blues of the ocean, golds of the sunset, the pale pinks of dawn. One evening, as she painted the view outside her window, she found herself humming, an old lullaby she used to sing to her children. She hadn't realized she still remembered it. A week later, she opened an old wooden box she'd carried with her, filled with unsent letters. Each one was addressed to her children. Each one started with, "My dear," and ended with, "Love, Mom." She read one aloud, her voice trembling. Dear Daniel, I know you're busy. I know your work is important, but I miss you. Not the lawyer, not the man you've become. I miss the boy who used to sing off-key with his little brother. If you ever read this, just know that I never stopped being proud of you. A tear slipped down her cheek and landed on the page. She pressed her palm over it, closing her eyes. Maybe, she whispered. I'll mail them one day. She didn't know that day was closer than she thought. It was a Thursday afternoon when her phone rang, a sound she hadn't heard in days. The number was unfamiliar, and for a second she almost ignored it. Hello? Mom? Her heart stopped. It was Daniel. For a moment she couldn't speak, just stared out the window as if the ocean might answer for her. Daniel. Honey, is that really you? Yeah, his voice was strained, distant. I heard from the realtor that you sold the old house. Where are you now? I moved to the beach, she said softly. Sunset Bay. The beach? He repeated, almost in disbelief. Alone? Margaret smiled faintly. Not alone. I've got the sea. There was a long pause on the line, the kind filled with all the words they didn't know how to say. Then Daniel exhaled. I might come visit. Maybe. Work's been... I understand, she said quickly, saving him the guilt. Whenever you can, sweetheart. The door's always open. When she hung up, she sat in silence, her hands trembling. A phone call, just one. But it felt like sunlight after years of rain. That night, the sky turned angry. The wind howled, and waves crashed violently against the shore. Margaret hurried to close the windows, clutching her cardigan tightly around her. Then, in the chaos of thunder, a memory returned. Tom's voice, gentle but firm. When life storms around you, Maggie, don't hide. Watch. You'll always find something beautiful afterward. So she stood by the window, watching lightning streak across the ocean. The storm was wild, yet mesmerizing, and as she stood there, her fear faded into wonder. By dawn, the storm had passed. The beach was covered in seaweed and driftwood, but the sky glowed soft pink. Margaret stepped outside barefoot, the sand cool beneath her toes. She looked up and whispered, You were right, Tom. It's beautiful after. Later that afternoon, as she swept her porch, she heard a sound she hadn't heard in 12 years. A knock, 3 steady knocks. Her heart raced. She wiped her hands on her apron and opened the door. A man stood there, holding a duffel bag and looking uncertain. Older, tired, with traces of the boy she used to know. Daniel? She breathed. He nodded. Hi, Mom. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Margaret took a shaky step forward and wrapped her arms around him. He hesitated, just for a heartbeat, then hugged her back, tightly. I didn't know where else to go, he murmured. You're home, she whispered, her voice breaking. You're always home. That evening, she cooked pasta, Daniel's favorite when he was a boy. They sat at the little table by the window, the same one that had once been empty. For a while, they just ate in silence. Then Daniel spoke softly. I'm sorry, Mom, for disappearing. For everything. Margaret reached across the table and took his hand. You don't have to apologize. You just have to stay a little while. He nodded, his eyes glistening. I can do that. Outside the waves rolled gently, as if applauding a reunion long overdue. After Daniel went to bed in the guest room, Margaret sat on the porch under the stars. She could hear his faint snoring through the window, the sound of a child at peace, not a man burdened by guilt. She closed her eyes and let tears fall freely, not of pain, but of quiet gratitude. The sea whispered softly in the dark, and for the first time in years, Margaret didn't feel forgotten. She felt found. The morning after Daniel arrived, the beach house smelled of coffee and warm toast, a scent Margaret hadn't woken up to in years. She hummed softly as she poured 2 mugs, the sound of waves mixing with the clink of porcelain. For a fleeting second, it felt like the old days again, when breakfast meant laughter, teasing, and someone running late for school. Only now, there were two grown souls trying to fill a silence that had lasted too long. Morning. Mom? Daniel said, walking in with damp hair and sleepy eyes. You shaved, she said, smiling. He grinned faintly. Yeah. Didn't want to scare the seagulls. They both chuckled. Awkward but genuine. It was a fragile kind of peace, like sunlight through cracked glass. After breakfast, Daniel stood by the window, looking at the sea. You really bought this place without telling anyone? Margaret nodded. Yes, I wanted something quiet. Something mine. He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. You should have called me, Mom. I could have helped. Her smile faded a little. You didn't even call on my birthday, Daniel. The words came out softer than she meant, a wound disguised as a whisper. Daniel froze. I know. I'm sorry, I didn't know what to say anymore. You could have just said hello, she replied. Silence stretched between them, heavy with years of distance. Finally, Daniel turned back toward the window, his reflection merging with the waves outside. I was angry, Mom, he said quietly. After Dad died, you shut down. You wouldn't talk to anyone. You acted like you were the only one who lost him. Margaret's breath caught. I lost my husband, Daniel. And I lost my father. He snapped, louder than he intended. But I still had to go to school, pretend everything was fine, take care of Claire and Eddie while you sat in his chair staring at the wall. Margaret's eyes filled. The pain she'd buried so carefully cracked open. I didn't mean to make you feel that way, she whispered. I just didn't know how to live without him. Daniel turned away, guilt and love warring across his face. I know, he said softly. I just wish you'd let us in back then. That afternoon, they went through a dusty box. Margaret hadn't opened in years. Inside were photos, family trips, school concerts, birthdays. Daniel picked up one photo of Tom carrying him on his shoulders, both laughing. God, I miss him, he murmured. Margaret smiled faintly. He'd be proud of you. Of all of you, Daniel exhaled. Claire doesn't think so. Her eyebrows lifted. Claire? He hesitated, then said quietly, She's not doing well, Mom. She and her husband split up last year. She didn't tell you? Margaret shook her head slowly, her heart sinking. No, I haven't heard from her in almost 5 years. Daniel looked at his mother, and for the first time, he realized just how much she had been left alone. That night, after Daniel went to bed, Margaret sat by the window with a cup of tea and the photo of Claire in her hands. Her daughter had always been her mirror, stubborn, fiery, full of questions. They had fought the most when Claire left for college. I'm not staying in this small town forever. Mom, she'd said, you don't have to, Margaret had replied, but don't forget where home is. And then one day, she did forget. Tears slid silently down Margaret's face as she whispered into the dark. Come back home, Claire. Just once. 2 days later, Daniel decided to stay a bit longer. Margaret pretended not to notice that his phone calls with his office were becoming shorter and less frequent. One evening, they walked along the shoreline together. The sky was streaked orange and pink, the tide licking their ankles. You know, Daniel said softly, when I was little, Dad used to say the sea listens better than people do. Margaret smiled. That's because it doesn't interrupt. He laughed quietly. Then his voice grew serious. Mom, I don't think Claire blames you. Not really. I think she blames herself. For what? For not being there when Dad passed. She couldn't handle it, so she just ran. Margaret stopped walking, the wind tangling her gray hair around her face. She was 17, she whispered. She shouldn't have had to handle any of it. Daniel nodded. Neither should you. That night, Margaret couldn't sleep. The waves were restless, tapping against the rocks like memories refusing to die. She walked into the living room and found Daniel sitting on the couch, staring at an old family photo. You're up, she said softly. He nodded. Couldn't sleep. This place, it brings everything back. She sat beside him, their shoulders almost touching. "Do you regret coming here?" she asked. He shook his head. "No, I regret waiting so long to come back to you." Margaret blinked back tears. "Oh, Daniel, I thought I was protecting myself," he said. "From missing Dad, from missing you." But all I did was make the silence louder. Margaret reached for his hand and held it tightly. "Then let's not waste what's left of our silence," she whispered. He smiled through tears. "Deal." The next morning, while cleaning the guest room, Margaret found something tucked behind the dresser. A small, unopened letter with faded edges. Her heart stopped when she saw the handwriting. It was Tom's. The envelope read, "For Margaret, to be opened when you feel lost." Her hands trembled as she sat on the bed and broke the seal. Inside, the paper was yellowed, the ink slightly smudged. "Maggie, if you're reading this, it means I'm not there to remind you that you were the best part of my story. Don't let loneliness trick you into believing you're forgotten. The kids will find their way back. They're your heartbeat. They always will be. Go where the sea meets the sky. That's where you'll start over. Love, Tom." Margaret's tears fell onto the page. She held the letter to her chest, whispering, "You knew. You always knew." When she told Daniel about it later, he just smiled through his own tears. Dad always was the smartest one. A few evenings later, as the sun sank behind the horizon, Margaret's phone rang again. The name on the screen made her gasp. "Claire." Her hand shook as she answered. "Claire?" A pause, then a trembling voice. "Mom?" Margaret could barely breathe. "Oh, sweetheart, I heard from Daniel you bought a beach house," Claire said softly. I don't know why, but I just needed to hear your voice." "You have no idea how much I needed to hear yours," Margaret whispered. There was silence, then a small sob on the other end. "I'm sorry, Mom, for everything." Margaret's tears came freely. "You don't need to be sorry, baby. Just come home." After the call ended, Margaret sat outside under a sky full of stars. Daniel joined her, handing her a blanket. "She's coming, isn't she?" he asked. Margaret smiled faintly. "She said she'd think about it." Daniel nodded, looking out at the waves. "Then she will. The sea doesn't just remember names. It calls them back." Margaret looked at her son, her once distant boy, and whispered, "Maybe it called yours first." He smiled. "Then let's hope it calls hers next." And together, they watched the ocean in silence. Two souls slowly stitching back what time had torn apart. The morning sky was pale blue, streaked with traces of silver mist when Margaret woke up. The ocean outside her window was calm, whispering softly against the sand, as if promising peace after all those storms. But Margaret's heart beat with nervous energy. Because today, her daughter might come home. For the first time in 12 years. She moved through the house quietly, brewing tea, setting out fresh linens, opening windows so the sea breeze could fill every room. She even placed a vase of wildflowers on the porch, daisies and sea lavender. Claire's childhood favorite, Daniel noticed. "You're nervous," he teased gently, pouring himself coffee. "I'm hopeful," Margaret corrected. "There's a difference," he smiled. "You used to say that when Dad was late for dinner." Her eyes softened. "And he always showed up, didn't he?" Daniel nodded. "Yeah, maybe Claire will too." As Margaret waited, she couldn't stop replaying the last time she saw her daughter. Claire was 17, angry, brilliant, aching to escape. They had argued that night. Margaret had told her, "You're too young to know what love costs," Claire had shouted back. "And you're too scared to live without it." Then she'd slammed the door and left, running off with a boy Margaret didn't approve of. A week later, Tom died, and the last words Margaret ever heard from her daughter were said in anger. She'd lived with that weight ever since. It was nearly sunset when Margaret finally heard it. The crunch of tires on the gravel driveway. Her heart leapt. Daniel came out onto the porch, wiping his hands on a towel. "Is that—" "Yes," Margaret whispered. A small gray car pulled up. The engine stopped. For a moment, no one got out. Then the door opened, and there she was, Claire. Her hair was shorter, her eyes older, carrying the kind of exhaustion that comes from too much life lived too fast. She wore a simple blue sweater and jeans, and for a second she looked just like the girl who used to read on the porch steps. "Hi, Mom," she said softly. Margaret couldn't speak. She just stepped forward, tears already falling. Claire hesitated, then suddenly ran to her. They collided in an embrace that shook with years of silence, anger and love that never truly died. "I'm so sorry," Claire whispered into her shoulder. Margaret held her tighter. "You don't have to be. You're here. That's all that matters." Daniel stood nearby, blinking rapidly, pretending the ocean wind had something to do with the wetness in his eyes. That night, the little beach cottage came alive. The smell of roasted vegetables and garlic bread filled the air. For the first time in over a decade, 3 chairs were filled around Margaret's dining table. They ate quietly at first, small talk about the weather, the beach, the neighbors, but under the surface, emotion rippled like an undertow. Finally, Claire put down her fork. "I don't deserve this," she said quietly. "Dinner, a place to stay. After everything." Margaret reached across the table and took her hand. "You deserve a home, Claire, always." Claire's lip trembled. "I wasn't there when Dad died. I couldn't handle it. I ran away because I thought if I didn't see it, it wouldn't be real." Daniel swallowed hard. "We all ran, Claire. Just in different directions." Margaret squeezed both their hands. "Then maybe it's time we stop running." For a long moment, none of them spoke, and yet the silence felt full. Full of forgiveness, understanding, and something dangerously close to peace. Later that night, the 3 of them sat by the small fireplace in the living room. The flames flickered softly, painting their faces in amber light. Claire curled up on the old couch, her legs tucked under her. "I used to dream about this place," she said quietly. "The ocean, the way Dad would laugh when Eddie splashed him. I thought maybe if I came here again I'd feel close to him." Margaret smiled sadly. "You don't need the sea for that, sweetheart. He's been in you all along." Claire looked down. "You sound like him." "I try," Margaret whispered. They sat like that for hours, talking about small things then big ones. About Claire's failed marriage, Daniel's sleepless nights, Margaret's quiet years alone. And though each story carried its own ache, together they began to form something whole. At one point, Claire stood and walked to the fireplace mantel. There, in a silver frame, was the old family photo, the one from their last summer at Sunset Bay. She picked it up slowly. "We look so happy," Margaret nodded. "We were." Claire studied her younger self, carefree, smiling, holding her brother's hands. "I used to hate this picture," she confessed. "Because I thought it was fake, like we were pretending everything was perfect." Margaret frowned. "It wasn't perfect, Claire, but it was real." Claire set the photo back down and turned to her mother, her eyes shining. "Then maybe we can be real again." Daniel cleared his throat softly. "There's still one more missing seat." Claire glanced at him, then looked down. "Eddie?" Margaret's voice trembled. "Have either of you heard from him?" Daniel shook his head. "Last I knew he was in Texas, some construction job." "But his number doesn't work anymore," Claire whispered. "He always hated phones," Margaret sighed, clutching her necklace, the little shell pendant Eddie had given her when he was 9. "I pray he's safe," she said softly. "I pray the sea remembers him too." After everyone went to bed, Margaret sat at the kitchen table, the moonlight spilling through the window. She opened her journal and began to write. "Dear Eddie, your brother and sister came home today. You should have seen them. So grown. So tired, so beautiful. I don't know where you are, my love. But if the waves reach you, let them whisper this. Your mother never stopped waiting. Love, Mom." She folded the letter and tucked it into the drawer next to Tom's old note. Then she whispered to the empty air, "One day, all 3 of you will be here again, and then I'll know I did something right." Outside, the tide rolled in and out, as if promising her that day would come. The next morning, sunlight filled the house. Daniel was cooking breakfast. Claire was humming softly in the kitchen, helping him. Margaret stood in the doorway, watching them, the rhythm of family slowly returning to life, the smell of pancakes, the sound of laughter, the warmth of togetherness. All things she thought she'd lost forever, now wrapped around her like the ocean breeze. For the first time in years, she whispered to herself, maybe this is what forgiveness sounds like. Sometimes, the hardest doors to reopen are the ones that lead home, but once you do, love rushes back in like the tide. The ocean was wild that morning. Waves crashed against the rocks like restless drums, and the sky wore a shade of bruised gray, the kind that warned of storms yet to come. Margaret stood by her kitchen window, clutching a cup of tea that had long gone cold. It had been a week since her children arrived, a week since her empty home had filled with voices that once echoed only in her memories, and though laughter now flowed between the walls, it carried a certain tension underneath, like a fragile bridge built over old wounds. The air smelled of salt, cinnamon, and something unspoken. At first, things had been magical. Her grandchildren ran barefoot through the sand, chasing each other with seashells and squeals. Samantha helped her cook breakfast, eggs, pancakes, and the same blueberry muffins they'd once made every Sunday. Even Jason, her eldest, who had always been reserved and distant, helped her fix the back porch railing without her asking. But beneath those gestures, Margaret could sense the invisible walls still standing. One evening, while folding laundry in the living room, she overheard Samantha whispering to Jason on the porch. The wind carried their words like faint confessions. Samantha, you think she's trying to buy forgiveness? Jason, I don't know. Maybe. Or maybe she's just lonely. Samantha, Dad said she didn't even call when he was sick. Jason, people change when they're hurt. Sam, maybe she thought we didn't want her. Margaret froze. Her fingers trembled over the linen sheets, and her breath caught in her chest. That was the truth she had avoided for years, that her silence had caused as much pain as their absence. She wanted to burst onto that porch and explain herself. But pride, that old, cruel ghost, held her tongue still. That night, the storm finally arrived. Rain battered the windows, lightning flashed across the sea, and thunder growled above the beach house. Margaret sat by the fireplace with her grandchildren, while the adults argued quietly in the kitchen. The children didn't understand what was happening, but they felt it, that heavy, invisible air that only grown-ups create when love is tangled with resentment. Jason's voice rose. You can't just show up after all these years and pretend everything's fine. Margaret, pretend? You think I don't know what I've done? You think I don't feel it every single day? Jason, then why now? Why the beach house? Why not before Dad died? Her voice broke. Because I was ashamed, Jason. I thought it was too late. I thought you'd all moved on. There it was. Her truth laid bare. The words trembled out like a confession to the wind. Samantha stepped closer, her eyes glossy with tears. Mom, you left us first, but we didn't stop waiting for you. The room fell silent except for the rain pounding the roof. Then, her youngest granddaughter, little Lily, walked into the kitchen and tugged Margaret's sleeve. Grandma, Daddy says you're sad. Are you sad because of us? Margaret knelt down, hugging the child tightly. Oh no, sweetheart. I'm sad because I forgot how much I loved you all. And then, something cracked open in that storm-lit house. Not the windows, not the walls, but hearts. Jason wiped his eyes first. Samantha followed, and in that moment the sound of thunder seemed to soften, as if the sky itself had grown gentle again. The storm passed by dawn, leaving behind a soft drizzle and a smell of wet earth. Margaret woke early, made coffee for everyone, and stepped outside to breathe in the ocean air. The clouds had begun to lift, and through them, sunlight shimmered like forgiveness. Hesitant at first, but growing warmer. Jason joined her on the porch, his hands in his pockets. "Mom, I'm sorry too," he said quietly. "We were angry for a long time. Maybe we just didn't know how to forgive," she turned to him, her voice trembling. "We both didn't know how to talk. Jason. But maybe now we can learn." They stood there together, not as mother and son burdened by years of silence, but as two souls finally ready to rebuild what had been broken. Samantha soon came out, holding mugs of coffee, and wrapped her arm around Margaret's shoulders. The grandchildren chased seagulls down the beach, their laughter mixing with the sound of waves. The world felt new again, fragile. Yes, but alive. The air after the storm smelled like something new. Damp, clean, and forgiving. The waves rolled in softer now, the sky a tender shade of silver. Margaret sat on the porch swing that morning with her old leather journal resting on her lap, the edges frayed and stained from years of touch. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside were not diary entries, but letters. Dozens of them, each sealed in yellowing envelopes, dated years apart, each addressed to the same people: Jason, Samantha, Emily, her children. She had written them every Mother's Day she'd spent alone. Margaret remembered the first one she'd written, 12 years ago, the first Mother's Day after the divorce. She had bought herself flowers that year, tulips. She placed them on the kitchen table, beside a half-eaten muffin and a cup of tea that had gone cold from crying too long. And then she had written, "Dear Jason, I'm sorry for yelling the day you left. You were only 15, but you spoke like a man and I didn't know how to answer. I wish I'd hugged you instead. Love, Mom." Every year after that, she wrote again. Some letters were long, others short. Some were angry, others full of regret. But she never mailed any of them. They had become her only way to speak when she no longer had the courage to pick up the phone. Jason found her that afternoon in the study, surrounded by the letters spread across the table like wilted petals. He frowned. "Mom, what are these?" Margaret looked up, startled, her eyes glassy. "I didn't mean for anyone to see them," she whispered. But it was too late. Samantha had walked in too, curiosity turning to silence when she saw her brother holding one of the envelopes. Jason read softly. "Dear Sam, you once told me you hated me. I can't forget that, but I know it came from hurt, not hate. I still make your favorite soup every winter. Maybe one day you'll come home and smell it again. Love, Mom." Samantha's eyes filled with tears. She sank into the couch, clutching the letter as if it were her heartbeat. "All these years, you did think of us," she said quietly. Margaret nodded. "Every day, but I didn't think you wanted to hear from me. Your father, he said you both needed time, and I mistook time for forever." Jason sat beside her. "Mom, you could have sent them. We would have read them. We would have called." She smiled faintly. "Would you have, Jason? Back then you were angry. I was stubborn. Maybe the world needed to wait until now." They spent the rest of the afternoon together, reading letter after letter. Sometimes they laughed, at Margaret's clumsy handwriting, or her habit of ending every page with "I'll try to be better." Sometimes they cried, especially at the ones she wrote when her health had been poor and she thought she might never see them again. One letter in particular broke everyone's silence. "Dear Emily, I kept your graduation photo on the fridge even though I wasn't there to take it. I told everyone at the grocery store that my daughter just graduated. I hope wherever you are you know I'm proud of you. Always." Emily, the youngest, who had barely spoken since arriving, began to sob quietly. She got up, walked over to her mother, and hugged her tight. "You were there, Mom," she said. "Maybe not in the pictures, but you were always there in your own way." Margaret broke down completely then, not out of sadness, but release. The letters she had hidden for over a decade had finally done what she had always wished, brought her family back to her. That evening, they sat by the fire. Jason suggested they write new letters, not from the past, but from the present. One by one, they took out sheets of paper, Jason wrote, "Dear Mom, thank you for not giving up on us." Samantha wrote, "Dear Mom, I forgive you and myself." Emily drew a heart and wrote, "Dear Grandma, can we make cookies tomorrow?" They laughed through their tears, and the sound of the ocean outside felt like applause. A slow, steady rhythm of peace. As they cleaned up, Margaret found one last letter tucked between the pages of her journal. It was different, sealed in a pink envelope, faded almost white with age. Her breath caught when she saw the name written on it. "To my future self." She opened it slowly. "Dear Margaret, if you're reading this, it means you're still here, still hoping, still waiting for the people you love to come home. Don't give up. One day they'll find their way back. Maybe not for the reasons you wanted, but for the reasons you need. Keep the kettle warm. Love, you." Her hands trembled, but her heart felt light. For the first time in decades, she realized she had kept her promise. The days after the storm drifted by like a slow tide. Calm, golden, and full of quiet laughter. The beach house, once heavy with silence, now buzzed softly with life. The smell of pancakes in the morning, the sound of children's feet on the wooden stairs, the sight of Jason reading a newspaper by the porch. Things Margaret once only dreamed of, now filled her days. But deep inside, she knew something fragile still lingered. Reunion was one thing. Staying together was another. It was Saturday morning when Jason made the announcement. He had been pacing by the kitchen counter, clearly nervous. Samantha was pouring orange juice for the kids. Margaret looked up from her cup of coffee and smiled. "You look like you're about to propose, Jason. Should I get my camera?" Jason chuckled, but his tone grew serious. "Mom, I have to go back next week. The firm needs me in Boston." The room fell quiet. Even the children stopped talking. "Already?" Samantha asked softly. "Yeah. I didn't plan to stay this long," he replied. "But I'm glad I did." Margaret felt her chest tighten. She tried to hide the disappointment with a smile. "Work is important, Jason. I understand." But her voice cracked on the last word. Samantha put down her glass. "I have to head back too," she said reluctantly. "The kids start school soon. It's been wonderful here, Mom. Really. But," Margaret interrupted with a gentle wave of her hand. "You don't need to explain. You have your lives." Jason frowned. "Mom, don't make it sound like we're abandoning you." She forced a laugh. "Old habits. Don't mind me." But inside, it felt like watching sunlight fade over the horizon. Too soon. Too quietly. That evening, as the sky melted into shades of lavender and peach, they gathered on the porch. The children roasted marshmallows while the adults sat in a circle, the ocean whispering softly below. Jason turned to his mother. "You know, Sam and I were talking earlier," he began, "about maybe making this a tradition." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "A tradition?" Samantha smiled. "Every year, around Mother's Day, we'll all come back here, to the beach house, no matter what's going on. No excuses." Margaret's hand flew to her chest. "You do that?" Jason nodded. "Yeah, you bought this house to bring us together. The least we can do is keep it alive, for all of us." Margaret's eyes filled with tears she didn't bother to hide. "Then I'll keep the rooms ready," she whispered. "And the muffins warm," the children cheered, not fully understanding the weight of the moment, but sensing its joy nonetheless. They toasted marshmallows as the stars began to appear, one by one, like promises lighting up the night sky. The next morning, Margaret woke early, as she always did. She brewed coffee, cracked the kitchen window open, and let the scent of salt and sunrise fill the room. For once, she felt truly at peace. Then came a knock at the door. It was gentle, almost hesitant. At first, she thought one of the kids was playing around, but when she opened it, the cup in her hand nearly slipped. Standing there, in a gray raincoat holding a small envelope, was Thomas, her ex-husband. Margaret's heart thudded. "Tom?" she whispered, her voice barely a sound. He looked older, frailer than she remembered. His once black hair now completely silver. His eyes soft but haunted. "Hello, Margaret," he said quietly. "I wasn't sure if I should come." For a moment, she couldn't move. So many years had passed. Years of silence, bitterness, and misunderstanding. And now here he was, standing on the porch of the house she'd bought to heal from him. Finally, she stepped aside. "You better come in before the wind blows you away." He smiled faintly and entered. The children's laughter echoed from the other room, and when Samantha appeared, her face turned pale. "Dad?" she whispered. Jason joined her, eyes wide. No one spoke for a long moment. Thomas cleared his throat. "I know I don't deserve a welcome. But I heard you were all here, and I needed to say something before it's too late." Margaret's breath caught. "Too late?" He looked down. "The doctors found something. It's not good. I didn't come to ask for forgiveness. I came because I don't want to leave without saying goodbye properly." The words hung heavy in the room. Margaret sat across from him at the dining table. The same table where years ago, arguments had burned like wildfire. Now, the only sound was the soft ticking of the wall clock and the ocean breathing outside. "Tom," she began quietly, "we both made mistakes." He nodded. "Too many. I pushed you away. I poisoned the way the kids saw you. I thought I was protecting them from the pain. But I only made it worse." Jason clenched his jaw. "You told us Mom didn't care. That she left because she was selfish." Thomas's eyes filled with shame. "I know, and I'm sorry. I was angry, not at her, but at myself. I couldn't handle losing everything." Samantha looked between them, her tears falling freely. "You both hurt us, but you also hurt yourselves." Margaret reached across the table and placed her hand over Thomas's. It trembled, but he didn't pull away. "Let's stop keeping score," she said softly. "We're too old to count scars." He looked up at her, eyes wet. "I never stopped loving you, you know," she smiled sadly. "I never stopped missing you." Later that night, after the children went to bed, the family gathered by the fire again. All of them. Even Thomas sat beside Margaret, wrapped in a blanket, sipping warm tea. Jason broke the silence. "We made a promise. Dad, every Mother's Day we come back here. You're welcome too, if you want." Thomas looked stunned. "After everything I did?" Samantha nodded. "After everything, Dad. That's the point." Margaret smiled at her children, then at the man she once thought she'd never forgive. For the first time in decades, the family sat together. Not perfect, not healed entirely, but whole in spirit. Outside, the tide rolled in quietly, brushing against the shore like a heartbeat returning home. The morning sun rose slow and golden, stretching its light over the sand like a warm blanket. The beach house stood quietly, bathed in the soft glow of dawn, every window glinting, every shadow gentle. Inside, the smell of coffee and blueberry muffins filled the air, the same smell that had haunted Margaret for years. The scent of memory, of absence, now wrapped itself around laughter, voices, and footsteps. It was Mother's Day again, but this time, she wasn't alone. Margaret stood by the stove, stirring oatmeal while the ocean breeze brushed her hair. Jason was helping the kids set the table outside on the deck. Samantha was arranging flowers, daisies and tulips, just like her mother loved. Emily was sketching the sea, her small hands smudged with pencil dust, and Thomas, her once distant, now frail ex-husband, sat on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, watching it all with soft, tired eyes. He had been staying with them for 2 weeks now, resting, talking, mending things no doctor could. The illness was real, but so was his peace. "Morning, sunshine," he said, smiling faintly as Margaret walked out with a tray. "Morning," she replied, her voice light. "You slept? A bit?" "Your snoring helped," she laughed, a real, unguarded laugh, the kind she hadn't had in years. When everyone gathered around the table, the air was filled with warmth, not just from the sun, but from presence. Jason raised a glass of orange juice. "To Mom," he said, for the beach house that brought us back, and for never giving up on us, even when we gave up on her. Margaret tried to speak, but her voice broke. Tears rolled down her cheeks as the children and grandchildren clapped and cheered. "I just wanted a place to hear laughter again," she said softly. "You all gave me more than that. You gave me family again." She looked at Thomas. He nodded, eyes glistening. "You gave me a second chance too." Margaret reached across the table, taking his hand. Her children exchanged quiet smiles, a language of understanding without words. After breakfast, Samantha's daughter, little Lily, ran inside and came back holding a small wooden box. "Grandma, what's this?" Margaret smiled. "Oh, that old thing. It's full of seashells and memories." Lily opened it carefully. Inside were tiny treasures, a baby's shoe, an old key, faded photographs, and several folded letters. Samantha recognized them immediately. "These are the ones you wrote to us, right?" "Some," Margaret said. "The rest, I wrote after you came back. I call them my thank you letters." Jason picked one up and read aloud. "Dear life, thank you for giving me one more chance to love the people I lost. I thought I needed to be forgiven. But what I really needed was to forgive myself." Silence followed, broken only by the sound of waves outside. Even the children seemed to understand the weight of those words. Later that afternoon, Margaret and Thomas took a slow walk down the beach. The tide washed over their feet, cool and rhythmic. "Remember when we used to bring the kids here?" he asked. "You mean before the shouting started?" She teased softly. He chuckled. "Yes, before that." They walked for a while without speaking, just listening to the sea's eternal song. Then he stopped, gazing out at the horizon. "I don't know how much time I've got left, Margaret." "None of us do," she said quietly. "But we have this moment, right now, and that's enough." He looked at her, eyes full of gratitude, not just for her kindness, but for her strength. "You were always the heart of us," he whispered. She smiled, squeezing his hand. "And you were the lesson." As evening came, the family gathered again on the porch. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. Jason had his arm around Samantha. The kids were roasting marshmallows again, and Emily played a soft tune on her ukulele. Margaret sat with Thomas beside her, wrapped in a single blanket. It was the same view she had once watched in loneliness. Now, it was a living portrait of everything she had ever wanted. "You did it." "Mom," Samantha said, watching the horizon. "You brought us home." Margaret smiled faintly, her eyes reflecting the light of the dying sun. "No, darling. Love brought you home. The beach house was just waiting for you." A year later, on the same date, the beach house was alive again. Same laughter, same ocean breeze, but one chair at the table was empty. Thomas's. He had passed peacefully that winter, in his sleep, with a letter beside his bed addressed to Margaret. "You taught me how to say goodbye without fear," it read, "and for that, I'll love you beyond this life." Margaret placed the letter in her memory box. When her children arrived for that year's Mother's Day, they found her sitting by the window, watching the sea, smiling through her tears. "He's still here," she said softly. "Just listening," Jason nodded. "So are we, Mom, always." They all gathered around her, holding hands, the sound of the waves steady and endless. Outside, the wind whispered through the dunes, not of loneliness, but of legacy. Time can take people, youth, and years away, but it can never take away love that learns to forgive. The greatest homes are not built of wood or stone, but of moments shared, apologies spoken, and hearts reopened. The end. Mother's Day at the beach house. Margaret reached across the table and placed her hand over Thomas's. It trembled, but he didn't pull away. "Let's stop keeping score," she said softly. "We're too old to count scars." He looked up at her, eyes wet. "I never stopped loving you, you know," she smiled sadly. "I never stopped missing you." Later that night, after the children went to bed, the family gathered by the fire again. All of them. Even Thomas sat beside Margaret, wrapped in a blanket, sipping warm tea. Jason broke the silence. "We made a promise. Dad, every Mother's Day we come back here. You're welcome too, if you want." Thomas looked stunned. "After everything I did?" Samantha nodded. "After everything, Dad. That's the point." Margaret smiled at her children, then at the man she once thought she'd never forgive. For the first time in decades, the family sat together. Not perfect, not healed entirely, but whole in spirit. Outside, the tide rolled in quietly, brushing against the shore like a heartbeat returning home. The morning sun rose slow and golden, stretching its light over the sand like a warm blanket. The beach house stood quietly, bathed in the soft glow of dawn, every window glinting, every shadow gentle. Inside, the smell of coffee and blueberry muffins filled the air, the same smell that had haunted Margaret for years. The scent of memory, of absence, now wrapped itself around laughter, voices, and footsteps. It was Mother's Day again, but this time, she wasn't alone. Margaret stood by the stove, stirring oatmeal while the ocean breeze brushed her hair. Jason was helping the kids set the table outside on the deck. Samantha was arranging flowers, daisies and tulips, just like her mother loved. Emily was sketching the sea, her small hands smudged with pencil dust, and Thomas, her once distant, now frail ex-husband, sat on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, watching it all with soft, tired eyes. He had been staying with them for 2 weeks now, resting, talking, mending things no doctor could. The illness was real, but so was his peace. "Morning, sunshine," he said, smiling faintly as Margaret walked out with a tray. "Morning," she replied, her voice light. "You slept? A bit?" "Your snoring helped," she laughed, a real, unguarded laugh, the kind she hadn't had in years. When everyone gathered around the table, the air was filled with warmth, not just from the sun, but from presence. Jason raised a glass of orange juice. "To Mom," he said, "for the beach house that brought us back, and for never giving up on us, even when we gave up on her." Margaret tried to speak, but her voice broke. Tears rolled down her cheeks as the children and grandchildren clapped and cheered. "I just wanted a place to hear laughter again," she said softly. "You all gave me more than that. You gave me family again." She looked at Thomas. He nodded, eyes glistening. "You gave me a second chance too." Margaret reached across the table, taking his hand. Her children exchanged quiet smiles, a language of understanding without words. After breakfast, Samantha's daughter, little Lily, ran inside and came back holding a small wooden box. "Grandma, what's this?" Margaret smiled. "Oh, that old thing? It's full of seashells and memories." Lily opened it carefully. Inside were tiny treasures, a baby's shoe, an old key, faded photographs, and several folded letters. Samantha recognized them immediately. "These are the ones you wrote to us, right?" "Some," Margaret said. "The rest, I wrote after you came back. I call them my thank you letters." Jason picked one up and read aloud. "Dear life, thank you for giving me one more chance to love the people I lost. I thought I needed to be forgiven. But what I really needed was to forgive myself." Silence followed, broken only by the sound of waves outside. Even the children seemed to understand the weight of those words. Later that afternoon, Margaret and Thomas took a slow walk down the beach. The tide washed over their feet, cool and rhythmic. "Remember when we used to bring the kids here?" he asked. "You mean before the shouting started?" She teased softly. He chuckled. "Yes, before that." They walked for a while without speaking, just listening to the sea's eternal song. Then he stopped, gazing out at the horizon. "I don't know how much time I've got left, Margaret." "None of us do," she said quietly. "But we have this moment, right now, and that's enough." He looked at her, eyes full of gratitude, not just for her kindness, but for her strength. "You were always the heart of us," he whispered. She smiled, squeezing his hand. "And you were the lesson." As evening came, the family gathered again on the porch. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. Jason had his arm around Samantha. The kids were roasting marshmallows again, and Emily played a soft tune on her ukulele. Margaret sat with Thomas beside her, wrapped in a single blanket. It was the same view she had once watched in loneliness. Now, it was a living portrait of everything she had ever wanted. "You did it." "Mom," Samantha said, watching the horizon, "you brought us home." Margaret smiled faintly, her eyes reflecting the light of the dying sun. "No, darling. Love brought you home. The beach house was just waiting for you." A year later, on the same date, the beach house was alive again. Same laughter, same ocean breeze, but one chair at the table was empty. Thomas's. He had passed peacefully that winter, in his sleep, with a letter beside his bed addressed to Margaret. "You taught me how to say goodbye without fear," it read, "and for that, I'll love you beyond this life." Margaret placed the letter in her memory box. When her children arrived for that year's Mother's Day, they found her sitting by the window, watching the sea, smiling through her tears. "He's still here," she said softly. "Just listening," Jason nodded. "So are we, Mom, always." They all gathered around her, holding hands, the sound of the waves steady and endless. Outside, the wind whispered through the dunes, not of loneliness, but of legacy. Time can take people, youth, and years away, but it can never take away love that learns to forgive. The greatest homes are not built of wood or stone, but of moments shared, apologies spoken, and hearts reopened. The end. Mother's Day at the Beach House.